DevelopSec, Developing Security Awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hi, and welcome to episode 23 of the DevelopSec podcast. I am your host, James Jardine, and today what I want to talk about is CMS applications, these content management systems that we can just quickly put together content and throw it on the internet. Very simple to do, things like Joomla, MediaWiki, WordPress. There's a bunch of these different third-party CMS systems that exist that we can use to simply put together content, and we can do it very rapidly. But hey, I've got content that I want to share with the world. Let me throw together one of these CMS systems, and bam, right? I get it installed, whether I do it hosted or I host it myself. A lot of these allow hosting yourself. WordPress, which we'll really kind of focus on throughout this podcast, actually allows you to host it at WordPress's site if you want. Which has its benefits, right? There's pros and cons to both sides. Nice that they kind of handle all the hosting of everything, the server management, all that stuff. Whereas if you self-host it, whether your hosting company does that, right? There's a lot more to it than using the actual CMS provider site to do this. But it gives us the ability to get content up and going. And sometimes we can do this in a matter of minutes if you've already got a domain or if you're using the hosted version of something like WordPress. I go create an account and I can start creating content and making it available fairly quickly, probably within a few minutes if I was really focused and I had something I really wanted to get out and make available. But one of the concerns we see of these is because it requires very little technical expertise. There's no HTML programming. There's no server setup. You don't have to know any of this stuff, right? I mean, anybody can start a WordPress site and start a blog, start just content. We see it for all kinds of different sites. It's not just blogs, right? Some people, their entire web frontage is WordPress or one of these CMS sites. So we don't have to have a lot of technical skill, but I can get a lot of information out to my customers, potential customers, friends, whoever it may be. So there's a lot of benefit to how these sites work, but we see them a lot of times from a security perspective in the news, right? There's vulnerabilities in them. A lot of these companies have a lot of people working on these applications, building them up so that way it is user-friendly, easier for you to use to get this content up there. But at the same point, like any application out there, we see vulnerabilities. And what really kind of piqued my interest about this is, probably 2 weeks ago, maybe a little bit more, I had seen a post and the title was, "More than 1 million WordPress sites open to SQL injection attacks." And so, as a WordPress user myself, you see that, it's like, oh, whoa, WordPress, what's going on there? You have some immediate concern. Is it going to affect my site? What's the problem here? And even better is, as I was looking this up and I was writing a blog post about this, I went in and typed in WordPress news, and maybe the fifth thing down on Google, there was another article that was actually released today, and today being March 10th is when I'm recording this, out on SC Magazine's site with the title of "Bug in WordPress Plugin Can Be Exploited to Take Full Control of Website." And that was published March 10th, 2015. So again, here we are. I just happened to be writing this today or getting ready to talk about it today. And I look it up, and sure enough, there's another release of a vulnerability related to WordPress. Now, a lot of people may think, oh, well, is WordPress not safe to use? Is it dangerous? Let me tell you something. WordPress is probably one of the most used CMS applications for getting content out there. I don't have actual statistics, but you can do a quick search and get an idea of the number of people that are using WordPress as their means to provide content out on the internet. Also, I would like to point out that while we do find vulnerabilities in the core of WordPress, like any application, What appears to me the most is that we see vulnerabilities within third-party plugins, right? WordPress has this capability to where anybody who wants to can create extension code to add functionality to your WordPress site, right? You're going to have stuff you want to do. Maybe I want that special bio box at the bottom of each post that I do. Maybe I want something to track statistics or user movement. Maybe I want to add multi-factor authentication to my login form, right? There's plugins to do a bunch of these. There's tons of plugins out there. And what we're seeing is that a plugin has a vulnerability, but when the news article comes out, it appears as though, WordPress has a vulnerability. But that's why you see that it's, 1 million WordPress sites may be affected. Well, 1 million is a pretty small number if you think about the number of WordPress installs that are out there, because it's really, there's 1 million installs that we're aware of that have this plugin installed, and the plugin is what's actually vulnerable. So that's something we really have to think about, and it speaks a lot to what we think about in general when we talk about analyzing what is actually the problem. Kind of one of the purposes of what I want to do with this podcast and with the site that I'm building up and sharing with everybody is, let's analyze the actual problem. The headline may say WordPress, 100 million WordPress sites or 1 million WordPress sites vulnerable. But when we start digging into that, it's like, it's just the sites that have this one plugin, and that plugin now has a patch. So, how do we apply that patch? But let's dig down to it. It's not WordPress. It's, there's a plugin that's vulnerable. And that's going to happen, right? And we probably will see a headline at some point that there's a vulnerability in WordPress itself. But we don't see it as often. So there's a couple things that I want to kind of just think about as we think about implementing these CMS systems. And it doesn't have to be WordPress. It could be one of these other CMS solutions that exist, because they all kind of function the same way, right? They have a core framework. They've got plugins. They've got default files that get installed during installation. They've got default security controls that exist. So I want to talk in general, but I'll use WordPress as my example. And by the way, I like WordPress. I'm a fan of WordPress. I use it in a lot of places. So don't take this as a bash on WordPress, because it's actually quite the opposite. I'm a fan of people using WordPress, and I want people that are using it to use it securely. And because it's a less technical requirement to use it, people are a little bit more lax about keeping up with it, right? It's kind of a install and I'm done, and I'll post some articles and I'm good, right? There's no concern. But there really is, right? So there's a couple things we want to check. One, when we install one of these systems, check to see if it has an auto update feature. We're always seeing updates. WordPress updates its core quite often. So you want to make sure that you're getting those updates. Now, of course, if you're going with a hosted version out at WordPress.com, then you're probably getting the most updated version, right? They're probably keeping that platform up to date as the new releases come out. If you're hosting it yourself, now you have to figure out, how do I do the updates? Depending on your hosting situation, some hosts have one-click installers that you can use that, click a button, it walks through some steps, it's installed, and then when it comes update time, they can actually update it for you. Or most recently, especially in WordPress's case, they actually have auto update capabilities where you can enable auto updates, so that way when a new release comes out, your site will automatically get updated. I use the auto updates. I've never had a problem with it, so I look around and knock on some wood, but auto updates have worked pretty well for me in those situations. So I'm a fan of using that auto update to make sure that the core system is updated properly. If you're not doing that, then obviously it requires a little bit more legwork on your side as the administrator of your site to go in and follow what's going on with that CMS. When do they release updates? knowing when to install those updates into your system to keep everything good. Because a lot of times those updates, while oftentimes bringing in extra features, also fix things like security vulnerabilities that may or may not have already been disclosed out there to the public. The next piece we need to think about is the plugins. And again, doesn't matter which system you're using, most of the systems allow some sort of plugin capability. WordPress has a ton of plugins that are available. I haven't seen where you can actually auto update plugins. You actually have to go into the admin interface and go in and say, yes, update this one, update this one, update this one. So some things, some thoughts that I have around plugins sit around the idea that, one, you should use the smallest amount of plugins that you can get by with, right? The more plugins that we have sitting out there, the more surface area or attack surface that we have for somebody to take advantage of. So if I don't need 100 plugins, I only need 3, well, then I only want to have 3 installed and running. I don't want the other ones sitting out there, because that's just an extra chance for somebody to be able to take advantage of my system and possibly gain access through a vulnerability in one of those plugins. So limit down and only use the plugins that you actually require, all right, that you need to be able to do what you're doing with your site. The second part is, now that you've got a list of the plugins that you're going to use, well, now we have to figure out how we track that inventory of those items and keeping track of, okay, I just saw something come up on the news. It's a WordPress thing. Let me go see if it is a plugin. If it's a plugin, is it a plugin that I have? If it's a plugin I have, okay, what's my next step? Is there a patch available that I can update the plugin? And in most cases, we're seeing that hopefully there's a plugin by the time the release goes live of the vulnerability. If not, well, then what's my next step? Do I disable the plugin while I wait for the update to come? Depends on the vulnerability, right? I mean, if it's an authentication bypass, which we're seeing a lot of when we see these plugin ones, if it's an authentication bypass, well, then maybe you want to disable it. If it's something that you have to be authenticated and it poses less risk, well, maybe you're okay with it and you can wait for the patch. But you need to think about that and analyze that. But the hardest part in all of this is actually tracking, when does my plugin have an update? Or understanding if my plugin has a vulnerability. And there's a couple ways you can do that. One way you can do it is by using a tool like WP Scan, which is WordPress Scan. It's out at wpscan.org. It's a simple scanner that goes out and scans your WordPress installation looking for what it is known for, known vulnerabilities. And it'll identify the plugins you have installed. It'll identify if there's updates to those plugins or if there's known vulnerabilities to those plugins. So this can be a simple way for you to go out and look for this. Now, if you're using the hosted WordPress, or if you're hosting this at some third-party hosting vendor, then you want to make sure before you start running scans against these sites that you have permission to run those scans against the site. Now, everything I've ever seen with WP Scan, it doesn't do anything malicious, right? I mean, it can pull and harvest usernames, it can identify plugins, and it'll let you know, hey, there's vulnerabilities available for these plugins, but I haven't seen it actually do anything attack-wise. But to be on the safe side, you want to make sure that you have permission to run any of these tools that send a lot of traffic up against your site, trying to determine this information. So use some sort of scanner like that can help you identify if those plugins that you're running do pop up on a list and you find out that, whoa, I'm running a vulnerable version of that. It's something we really want to think about. Using the security controls that exist within the systems, right? Don't enable features you don't need. If your system doesn't require comments, then disable comments, right? The less surface area that people have to input data to your system, the less area they have for inputting attack strings and attacking your site and trying to basically cause mayhem for you. So if you don't need features like that, disable them. If you've got the ability to enable things like multi-factor or two-factor authentication, enable it, right? Things that can make it the authentication stronger, the session management better. Look at the controls that exist and determine which ones you want to enable. You probably are not going to get to the point where you're, blacklisting IPs and only whitelisting your IP to post articles and, really getting down into this, because most sites don't need that. You have to think about what your site is, and you want to think about usability. If you can't use the site that you've built, well, then you kind of defeat the purpose of building the site in the first place. So you don't want to get caught in that situation. Also, removing default configurations. We don't really see as much anymore the default username and passwords on a lot of these CMS systems. Back when they first came out, everybody installed with the default, be like admin, and, oh, hey, I see it's a WordPress install. Let me just go log in. Oh, yep, that fool didn't change the username and password. I'm in. We don't see that as much anymore. WordPress, I know, going through multiple installs, prompts you, right? Hey, what's the username? What's the password? They don't have a default sitting out there, which is a good thing. So make sure and pay attention as you're going through installing these things that you're setting that stuff up. If there is some sort of default that was provided, make sure you go in and change it, because default passwords are so easy to figure out that you want to at least do the minimum and change that so nobody else can just run by with an automated scanner and have it log in and deploy malware to your site. Other things to think about that during installation of these systems, they often drop a lot of files that are used to create the system, but then oftentimes don't clean them all up, and there may be files left over. So you want to look at those. And again, WP Scan will help you identify those for WordPress of files that may not be needed anymore that you can go in and clean up. But we want to make sure that special files used for things like installation get cleaned up. And the instructions for WordPress for installing it, if you're installing it yourself, are pretty good at explaining what you need. This goes here, get rid of this. So make sure you follow those. And stay up to date, right? Be aware. Know what systems you're using. All too often, we come in and we do pen tests, and we find something like a WordPress site or Joomla stood up someplace, and it's got some weakness in it that should have been fixed. But when you start talking to people, you start to realize that they didn't even know it was there. Somebody just happened to install it on a whim on this server, and somehow it's just got left out there. And now there's this vulnerable system sitting out on the network that was the key to the demise of the whole thing. So we want to make sure that we're aware of what it is we're using. These CMS systems work, right? We see them all over the place. We talk about it a lot when we see some of the news articles on our newscast, when we do Down the Security Rabbit Hole for that podcast. And, the big takeaway is, how do the people that are using these type of systems keep them secure? Because as I mentioned, oftentimes because of the lack of technical requirements, anybody can go grab it, throw it up there, and then we just assume that it's good to go. We don't have to think about keeping up with it. We don't have to think about patching it. It's just, my site's there and it's running. And that can't be the way that we do this, right? We have to spread the word and let people know, hey, if you're using these sites, you do have to maintain them. They do have updates coming out all the time, especially ones that have active development going on. There are updates, there are security fixes, there are patches, there's new features being added. We need to be aware of those, and we need to constantly be updating it. And the good news is, it's not technical either, right? I mean, we can stay non-technical and still keep our blog updated, our WordPress site updated, our Joomla site updated, because oftentimes these are just one-click updates. They're making things easy for us to do this. And let's use that benefit, right? These things are beneficial. We want to use them. So keep in mind, and as I mentioned, I talk a lot about WordPress in here, and that's just because I see that one a lot in the news headlines because of the plugins. But all those keys that we just talked about are the same for all these other CMS systems. Doesn't matter what CMS system you're using. they all support the same type of functionality. They all support the same type of installations. Know your system, go through it, protect it, and just be aware. Be aware of what's happening out in the internet to things that you're using. It's no different than if you're using Windows. It's no different if you're using other software packages, right? You should be aware of the software you're using. Be wary and aware if it pops up someplace that there's vulnerabilities in it, and then understand how to go in and apply the patches to fix those vulnerabilities so your system stays safe and secure. So I'll actually post a link over to the blog post that I'm posting at the same time I'm posting the podcast, and vice versa. So they'll link back to each other, so that way if you want to read a bunch of what I've thought, which is mostly what I stated here, you can read it. And as I'll state in the blog, if you don't want to read it and you want to listen, then that's what the podcast is for. So I thank you for listening. This wraps up episode 23, where we talk about the CMS security. And then we'll be back again soon with episode 24, with what I'm hoping is another, good idea, good topic that we can discuss that everybody will find interesting. So again, I thank you for listening. Don't forget, check out the website. You can follow me on Twitter. It's DevelopSec, or you can follow me at Jardine Software. Either one works. I track both of those accounts. But send me your feedback. If you like what's going on, I'd love to hear it. If you don't like what's going on, I'd like to hear that too, so I can fix it and hopefully do some more stuff that you like, because I do this for you guys. Otherwise, it's just me sitting here in a room rambling. So again, thank you, and we'll see you on the next episode. You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec, and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.